Hello everyone. A very good morning to all guys. Myself Priyanka Rao. Welcome to Rao Biology classes. So guys, in my previous lecture, I was starts membrane transport process. Okay. So let's start or continue this topic membrane transport process with active transport. So first of all, we give a outline of your previous lecture. So guys, I was explained that membrane transport process first of all is that there is a transport of ions or molecules across the plasma membrane. Then further, I was explained that the membrane transport is of two types: active transport process or passive transport process. Okay. So in my previous lecture, I was explained about passive transport process. So, passive transport process means that there is a movement of ions or molecules across the plasma membrane along the concentration gradient. Here, the concentration gradient means that movement of ion from higher concentration to lower concentration. Okay, that you all know that when the molecules move from higher concentration to lower concentration, so no energy is required during this process. So passive transport process is energy independent process, or we say that it is an ATP independent process. So next, the passive process further is of two types: simple or facilitated diffusion. Okay, first of all, I was explained that in my last lecture that simple diffusion is also along the concentration gradient process, but is a slow process. They are energy independent process, or they don't require any protein or channels for transport of our ions. So guys, during simple diffusion, and we transport the ions or molecules along the lipid matrix. Okay, then the second one is that about facilitated diffusion. Here I was explained that facilitated diffusion is somehow similar to simple diffusion, but here they required some carrier or channels for transport of some specific ions or molecules. So in simple diffusion, we transport only non-polar molecules along the plasma membrane. Okay, or through facilitated diffusion, we transport polar molecules also. Further, facilitated diffusion is occur through channel mediated, carrier mediated, or channel mediated. I was give some examples of carrier mediated transport or channel mediated. Carrier mediated transport example is of um, sorry yes, carrier mediated transport is of example is that GLUT. Here GLUT is defined as glucose transport. So in GLUT, we with the help of GLUT we transport glucose molecule across the plasma membrane. For example, it is present in RBC, liver, or brain, but in different series. Okay, then there is an example of channel protein. I was gives example of channel mediated transport. Okay, the channel mediated transport example is aquaporin. These channels are required for water molecule transport along the plasma membrane. Okay, here the aquaporins are the channel which behaves by tunnel protein. Here in plasma membrane there is an interior protein, intrinsic proteins are present which behaves as a channel proteins. Okay, so in this lecture I was explained about active transport process. Today we start active transport process. First of all, we define active transport. There it is just opposite to passive transport process, guys. Active transport means that transport of ions or molecules along the plasma membrane or across the plasma membrane, along lower concentration to higher concentration gradient, which means that from lower concentration of ions or molecules towards the higher concentration. Okay, So when we move from an lower area to higher area, hilly area, we require some energy or to move along this way. Okay, because they are opposite way to lower to higher region. So for example, when we move along when we move a path where there is a hilly area, we require energy. The energy is that when we move through a vehicle or by driving a car or a bicycle, or a motorcycle, we our vehicle use fuel in the form of energy. Okay, so it is a forceful process or ATP dependent process. So we call that active process is an ATP dependent process. Dependent process. Okay. Or it performs against the concentration gradient. Against concentration gradient. I was explained that against concentration gradient means that from lower to higher region. Okay. So secondly, active process is a vital process also, and the active process decreases when the temperature decreases. Okay, so next is that active process is divided into two parts. It became a primary active process or secondary active process. Okay, so the active processes of two type. First of all, I am explaining about primary active process. Primary active process is a pump mediated process. Okay, or we call that is a pump mediated process. Okay. Secondly, the primary active process is also defined as an active process. Here, the low concentration to high concentration movement of molecules or ions. But in secondary active process, it is a carrier mediated process. And the primary active process utilize direct energy, or so we define as that the primary active process is the process in which energy can directly utilize during the transport of molecules, and in secondary active process we defined as here the energy are indirectly utilized during the transport of ions or molecules. Okay, so let's start the active transport in detail. First of all, the primary active transport. Primary transport. It is in it there is a direct utilization of energy. Direct utilization of energy during the process. Here the primary transport example is sodium potassium pump. We all are favorable from the class I think 10th and about sodium potassium pump. The sodium potassium pump perform that performed by there is a plasma membrane. Okay, this is the plasma membrane. It is an extracellular space, or it is an intracellular space or cytosolic space. Okay, here there is an pump in the intracellular space. Firstly, sodium concentration is high. Okay, and extracellularly potassium ion concentration is high. Okay, so the sodium ions are moved outside. 3 sodium ions move outside and 2 potassium ions move inside. Okay, so here the 3 sodium ions move outside and 2 potassium ions move inside the cell. There is an ATP utilized. Here an ATP is directly utilized. ATP is directly utilized. ATP convert into ADP. Okay, so this process utilizes direct ATP or energy. So that we call that it is an direct energy utilized process. So it is most famous or most favorable example of primary active transport. Conclusion from this pump is that here the uh, there is a decrease of sodium ions intracellularly by increasing the potassium ions intracellularly. Okay. Secondly, there is a secondary active transport. Here it is, we call that carrier mediated transport. Most important example of this is that sodium proton pump and one example is sodium glucose transport. Okay, but it is symport or antiport transport. Firstly, we understand about symport transport. Symport transport, in this process, two molecules move simultaneously in a same direction. For example, there is a plasma membrane. Okay. When the molecules move in same direction, when the molecules, two molecules A and B, move simultaneously in same direction through across the plasma membrane, this process we call that symport process. Okay, but when the molecules move in opposite direction, okay, that is A, that is B, okay, when the molecules move simultaneously but in opposite direction, we call that process is an antiport transport. Okay, so there is example, symport transport involves sodium glucose transport. Okay, or the antiport transports involves sodium proton exchange pump. ठीक है? Okay, first we explain about sodium glucose transport. There is a membrane or a cell. There is a cell. Here the sodium are, okay, they require carrier mediated. This is the carrier mediated. Okay, when the sodium ions move inside the cell, so glucose is also move along with sodium ions inside the cell. Okay, here the sodium ions, no energy is utilized at this place. Here the sodium ions inside the cell concentration is high, so we perform on another side of the cell as sodium potassium pump. Okay, here the sodium ions move outside the cell, 3 sodium ions move outside the cell and 2 potassium ions move inside the cell. Okay, so during this process, here an ATP is utilized and it convert into ADP. So here there is an indirect utilization of energy. Indirect utilization of energy. Okay. So they are mediated by, there is a carrier mediated process. First of all, the glucose ion move along with sodium ion inside the cell. So the sodium ion concentration increase inside the cell. So we perform a sodium potassium pump. Okay. When we perform the sodium potassium pump, 3 sodium ions move outside the cell and 2 potassium ion moves inside the cell. Okay. During this whole process, we utilize ATP. So we say that in many exams there is a question is asking that during movement of 3 sodium ions and 2 potassium ions along across the plasma membrane, how many molecules of ATP we require? We require only one ATP molecule hydrolysis. Okay. So this is an indirect utilization of energy. Okay. So guys, we all conclude that active transport required for absorption and reabsorption of nutrients which we required, and secondly the active transport maintain the ions and molecules concentration and across the cell, and second thing is that it is required for maintaining resting potential across the plasma membrane when the cells are in relaxed position. Secondly, and it maintain also a concentration gradient inside the cell or outside the cell. So this is all about active process, and there is a passive process. One process is remaining is bulk transport, which I will explain in my next lecture. Okay. So guys, please share and subscribe my channel, and thank you for listening me carefully.